As Kikwaza said, we're beginning a 4-week journey through the book of Nehemiah, one of the Old Testament books. And it's one of my favorite Old Testament books. You know, it's got lots to teach us. It's a masterclass on leadership. It's a handbook on prayer. It's a workshop on how to handle opposition. It's a study on how to find your passion. And it's a really powerfully motivating account of what happens during spiritual renewal. It's a great book. It's very readable. And it's an account, too, of how under a young leader, a city that had lost its way and become broken became beautiful again. So I think it's a book which has lots to speak to Nairobi life today. And Nehemiah is the last of the historical accounts in the Old Testament. So if the Old Testament was actually put in chronological order, Nehemiah would have been right near the end of the Old Testament with just one or two prophetic books written after it. And in many of the kind of early versions of the Bible, the book of Nehemiah is joined together with the book of Ezra, and many people say that the actual tail end of the book of Nehemiah is actually written not by Nehemiah but by Ezra. And a bit of background before we kind of read the passage so you know what the background situation is. We're going back to 586 BC. Jerusalem's invaded by the Babylonians. The Jewish people got scattered all over the place, and much of Jerusalem gets destroyed. But this story, the story of Nehemiah, begins in 444 BC. And Nehemiah is living in a Persian city called Susa. That's kind of part of modern-day Iran. And there's almost 3 phases in this journey. You can almost think of Nehemiah as being a 3rd season of Jerusalem being restored. So the first season, season 1, centers around Zerubbabel, rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And season 2 is when Ezra rediscovers the law and reminds the Jewish people about the law. And this final season, season 3, is where Nehemiah oversees the rebuilding of the wall around Jerusalem. And we call this talk today, I Can't Take It Anymore. And we're going to read the first chapter of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah chapter 1. We're going to read the whole chapter, which is 11 verses. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the furthest horizons, I will gather them from there and bring them back to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeem by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servants and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. A question. I wonder what makes you cry. Maybe it's a tearjerker of a movie. Maybe it's a birth. Maybe it's a wedding. Maybe it's stress or pain. Maybe it's a funeral. You probably realize I'm British, and in more ways than I would like, I'm a pretty stereotypical British guy. And British men don't cry. Definitely not at a film or a wedding. Football goes with the territory. Maybe a British guy might cry under severe stress or at a funeral. But I wonder when you last cried. There's no shame in this, but has anyone cried today? Anyone going to be honest enough, brave enough to own up that they cried today? No one. Anyone cried this week? We're getting there. A few. This month? Oh, we're getting there. A few more. Maybe you last cried. It was so long ago that you can't remember. I'm not going to kind of embarrass you publicly, but think back to when you last cried and I wonder what made you cry. What made you cry? You see, this story begins with Nehemiah crying. And what makes Nehemiah cry? A wall. A broken down wall. And I have to say, the British part of me wants to say to this guy, why are you crying about a wall? Why? Come on, it's just a wall. For goodness sake, don't cry about a wall. And this passage, which in many ways is just a record of Nehemiah praying, is going to show us how God works in us and through us to see communities renewed when we can't take it anymore. And we're going to look at 4 things which are key to this renewal of community. And the first thing we see is that community renewed begins with a burden. A burden. Nehemiah knew that Jerusalem's wall was broken down. It wasn't new news. But when his brother Hananiah came to see him and gave him a first-hand account of the condition of Jerusalem, it was a life-changing conversation. Nehemiah wept, he mourned, he fasted, and he prayed. And you see, the thing I'm convinced of is that God uses people with a burden for his purposes. When God wants to use us in some way, he often burdens us with a passion for a situation. And often that burden is way more than just feeling, oh, that's sorry, that's sad, that's unfortunate. Sometimes God gives us a burden which is a kind of discontent which doesn't go away. Sometimes it can be a passion that excites you. Sometimes it can be a deep pain. And sometimes it happens when we get close to a situation or close to a person, we begin to see that pain in a fresh way. That pain changes our perspective. Proximity often can birth pain. And pain can breed a burden. If you chat to Salonka, who works with the guys we try and bust out of remand prison, she feels their pain. Hanging out with the Ajar clients causes her pain. I think crying should be written into Salonka's job description. I have never known someone cry as much, but it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. Because she feels their pain. She has a burden for God's purpose, for justice. And in this passage, the wall of Jerusalem is kind of representing the defense of a city. In those days, a city was defended by its wall. So when the wall is broken down, the city ends up being defenseless. The wall was broken down meant that the city was open to attack. God's people being open to attack. And as I read this passage, it got me thinking about this metaphor of walls around our lives being broken down. Because if there's walls in our lives being broken down, it can leave us open to attack. You know, if our social life is out of control, you're open to attack. If your use of alcohol is out of control, you're open to attack. If your relationships are out of control, you are open to attack. If you're in a state of perpetual distraction, you are open to attack. You need to mend your broken down walls. So which walls in our lives are broken down and leave us open to attack? And the book of Nehemiah shows us how great community can rebuild walls and prevent attack. And Nehemiah begins by weeping. You see, a community renewed is always born out of compassion. Jesus says this in Matthew 9, seeing the people, he, Jesus, felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. And I think a prayer we've got to learn to pray is, Jesus, please give me a deep compassion that won't go away and stirs me into action. I wonder what's your burden. Maybe you don't feel you've got a particular burden. Maybe you need God to give you a holy, compassionate discontent. And the good news is God's burdens are light. Probably 20 years ago, God gave me a burden for something that keeps me going still to this day. It energizes me, it focuses me, it constrains me. God's burdens give us passion. And I was reading this week about some research about passion and apathy. I found somewhat to my surprise that in many areas of life, millennials and Gen Zs are viewed as being the generations that are the least likely to care deeply about stuff. And it surprised me, particularly, I suppose, given what we've seen in this nation over the last month or so. But statistically, it's the Gen Zs and it's the millennials who are the most apathetic generation. They don't care enough. They don't care deeply. And I would love it to be the case that in God's church we see that narrative change. That God helps us to care deeply. So community renewed begins with a burden. And it continues with a prayer. You see, Nehemiah is incredibly realistic in assessing the problem. You know, he realized that the heart of the problem is not a lack of organization, although they desperately needed someone to organize things, which Nehemiah ultimately did. And the solution is not just about resources, though the project required resources. The solution began by praying. And it's fascinating to read how Nehemiah prays. I've just picked out one verse to focus on, verse 5, where Nehemiah prays this. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him. And I love how he addresses God, the great and awesome God. I wonder if that's how you began your prayers this morning. Awesome God. It certainly wasn't how I began mine. That word awesome has become so devalued. Have a tasty burger and it's awesome. Wow. Normal things have become awesome. And I think that's awful. Do you see God as being awesome? Do you pray to God as awesome? Maybe we need a bigger view of God. But the lovely thing is that Nehemiah doesn't just see God as awesome, he sees him as loving. He is the one who keeps his covenant of love. I'm reading a great book at the moment. I love the title. That was what attracted me to the book. It's called Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools. Really recommend it. It's such a good book on prayer. And the author said something in there that really made me think. He talked about the time when the disciples would have been observing Jesus praying. And of course, the disciples would have been well used to prayer. It was what they did. It was part of their culture. But something about observing Jesus praying stirred them. They realized that maybe their own prayer life was not cutting it. So they came to Jesus and said, Jesus, teach us to pray. And Jesus taught them a prayer, which we call the Lord's Prayer. And it's interesting that within the kind of Protestant church, we describe that prayer as being the Lord's Prayer. But in much of the Catholic Church, they call it not the Lord's Prayer, but they call it the Our Father. And in an odd way, I think that's a much better title. Because what I think maybe the historical Catholic Church have realized is that best prayer stems from Our Father. From that intimate knowledge of the goodness of God, the loving nature of God. Our Father. The world's best prayers come from an encounter with our Father. So prayer changes things, prayer changes us, so that we change things. Community renewed begins with a burden and a prayer. But there's a third thing, and it's the need to wait. You see, in chapter 1, it says that Nehemiah began praying in the month of Kislev, which is our November, December time. But if you go on and read chapter 2, verse 1, we see that Nehemiah doesn't act until the month of Nisan, which is our March or April. So there's this 5-month delay between Nehemiah hearing this news, getting this burden, and beginning to act. And I think God enjoys waiting. I think God enjoys us waiting. And that irritates me. Because I'm an activist. I like to do things and I like to solve problems now. I want to fix them now. But God enjoys waiting. And our culture says, don't wait. I'm sure you, like me, have felt that exasperation when that web page takes that extra second and a half to load. We are so bad at waiting. There's always purpose in waiting, in God's waiting. Maybe we get tired of waiting for things to change, waiting for God to show up. But God is in our waiting. So it's vital we don't despise our waiting. We don't give up in our waiting, even if that waiting frustrates us. God is in waiting. You may be waiting for a job, you might be waiting for a partner, you may be waiting for a relationship to resolve, and that may frustrate you. But keep praying, keep waiting. The wise find Jesus in the waiting. And finally, this: there's a cost. Community renewed always involves cost. We read right at the end of chapter 1, verse 11, that Nehemiah was cupbearer to the king. And it's important here we don't kind of think waiter, not even kind of sommelier, not wine waiter. Think COO, think number 2 to the king. This is the guy who checks on the king's food, samples the king's wine, has all the king's authority. Nehemiah would have had the best food, the best clothes, lived in a great home. He had a really cushy job. But when he hears about the distress of God's people, he's no longer happy in his great job, in his luxurious surroundings. And bizarrely, he's willing to give it all up, to make the difficult journey to Jerusalem, to set about the stressful job of mobilizing the people to rebuild the wall so that God's name would be honored. Community renewed always involves personal cost. I wonder what's the cost we might have to pay for the burden God has placed on our hearts. Nehemiah, it cost him time, status, energy, money, relational heartache. What's the cost that Jesus wants you to pay to see a community renewed? So we've got a burden, a prayer, a weight, and a cost for community renewed. So what's your burden? What's your prayer? Will you wait? What cost will you be willing to pay?